Welcome to our podcast. Today we have the privilege of diving into the world of sports science and high-performance coaching with a true expert in the field. Our guest is Dr.Fergus Connolly, a renowned sports scientist, performance consultant, and is the author of the groundbreaking book, Game Changer, The Art of Sports Science. Fergus has extensive background working with elite athletes and professional sport teams and is the only coach to have worked full-time in every major league around the world, such as the NFL, NBA, Australian rules football, pro boxing. Fergus also advises elite military units and companies across the globe. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So in addition to working with pro athletes, you've advised elite military units and companies. How does your approach to high-performance coaching overlap when applied to business or entrepreneurial environments?
One of the things that, so early in my career, my very first job was in the Premier League. And so you start in soccer and you spend so much time when you're younger working hard to understand everything that's going on and apply it. And then coach left and without a job. And the next offer came from rugby. And I didn't know a lot about rugby, to be honest, but this was the Welsh rugby team. So at the beginning, I'm thrown into this and I'm going, oh, this is so different from soccer. And it is initially, but then slowly you realize the human doesn't change from sport to sport. Then you move to another sport and the very same thing happens. The detail of the game that we might watch looks different, but it's still the same person. So stress affects them, for example, in the same way. Fitness is the same, just different things are emphasized. So in the NFL, college football, strength is more important than in soccer, whereas soccer is incredibly skillful. Then whether it's a military unit or even a business person, how people learn, how you manage them, those principles are the same. Now, the application might look a little different, but the principles remain the same. And then with people who are on very stressful environments, again, they have developed a particular mindset. So when you take a step back from the real detail and you realize the one thing that doesn't change in any of those environments is the human. And so the principles are transferable. And so I always tell people that early in their career, don't get too fixated. If you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation, take a moment, take a step back and see it as a great learning opportunity. Because what I thought was something that was really difficult actually turned out to be one of the most important learning lessons for me in my career.
One of the things I thought was interesting in your book is when you were talking about team sports that have a ball, whether it's soccer, football, basketball, whatever, any sport with a ball, basically there's only two components and they're all the same in every sport, which I believe you said was time and space, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like particularly in team sport, again, it takes a little while to step back, stop looking at the names on the jerseys, stop getting involved in the personalities and the emotion that we're inclined to do as fans. When you take a step back and you look at it coldly, and when you're working with a team, you often get access to overhead cameras that look at the field just entirely, and it doesn't move. And you start to see patterns of movement. I gave a talk a number of years ago. I used a beehive, a fixed camera on a beehive, and you start to see patterns, and then patterns emerge. And then if you look at field sport, it's the very same thing. These patterns emerge, and what you start to realize are that when a team has a ball, the goal and the principle is the exact same. With the team that doesn't, the goals and the principles are the same. And when you look at fields, like I said, from that perspective, then you start to see, okay, space is actually incredibly important. And then how you time it, how you move the ball, how people move. And so the principles of team sports are very, very similar.
Since you've worked with every sports team basically throughout the globe, or I should say at least in terms of different sports, how applicable is, say, like rugby to them when you worked with the San Francisco 49ers, I believe, was that a decade ago when Justin Smith and some of those other players were there. But like, how did that translate? And I'm actually surprised to see that in the modern NFL in 2024 that we don't see players running down the field with planned laterals where they're incorporating rugby, where they're throwing the ball behind them and moving down the field that way. Do you ever think we'll actually see the NFL modernize to that?
So one of the biggest challenges that you have, and we actually brought in rugby players. Actually, when I got there, Lawrence Okoye was there. He had been an Olympic shot put champion. One of the biggest challenges is in the NFL, when you're coming into it, at that stage, you've got so many years of college and high school football. So your knowledge of the game, even your unconscious knowledge of the game, is so well developed. It's very difficult for a player to transfer over. But there are some things that can be transferred, for example, tackling and and learning from, for example, from an injury prevention mechanism, why sports that don't have the protective gear, how they have to prepare. The other area that is probably the most valuable is one of the biggest challenges in rugby is that you don't have the same selection or choice that you have in football here. So if you think of the number of athletes who play, the filter, the choice, there's a huge number of people that filter down. In rugby, you can only select from certain areas. For example, if you're obviously only from Ireland, you can only pick Irish players. So therefore, the development of a person becomes far more important. They're not as disposable, perhaps that's not the right word, but they're not as replaceable, I guess, is a better term to use. So you have to develop players. You have to study, you have to find the limitations, and you have to work on and improve that player. And that's an area of huge importance. It would save teams a lot of money when you have a player who's just about making it to the line. How do we not just problem solve, how do we identify what the problem is? How do we develop that incredibly valuable asset that we spent a lot of time on and retain them? In sports where you've guaranteed contracts, obviously it's worth a lot of money. In sports where you don't have guaranteed contracts, there's less of an incentive.
I like the Pareto principle in a lot of things, or basically the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the results are due to 20% of the inputs. And I'm big into mountain biking, for example, and I find it interesting that I'll have friends that are like pretty high-end mountain bikers that will spend thousands of dollars on upgrades to shave off ounces, or in some cases grams, when they could just lose 5 or 10 pounds and get significantly more benefits. Chris Froome and the Tour de France is probably the best example of that, where he basically lost 20 pounds, went from being back of the pack to a multiple-time Tour de France winner. In terms of the sports as a whole, what are some of the 80-20 principles that people can implement?
That's a wonderful question. Actually, I had 2 conversations, one last week with a company actually. We were talking about the dangers of overcoaching their executives, giving them too many directions as opposed to, again, back to what I'm speaking about, principles, creating a gap, and then tools, and letting them use the tool as required. Because sometimes you can, like I said, overcoach. It's interesting you bring up cycling, because that was one of the areas that I spent a lot of time studying on that very point about managing weight, looking at effectiveness and efficiency, because some of the best coaches actually use that as the key metric. What is the power output per weight, and understanding what that decrement is over time. And in team sports, of course, because it's intermittent, it's like a series of time trials. It's not just one time trial. So again, looking at power and weight. Sometimes power can be challenging to improve, but you can certainly improve weight. So you can reduce, for example, body fat, different things like that. And so that in and of itself is one of those, I think the term that's used most commonly is low-hanging fruit. I hate the term because it's just overused. But particularly, even just making small changes in diet with regard to quality food, and just making small improvements in the awareness and education of players as to which foods to eat, even if you just start with the order of foods. For example, prioritizing fruit and vegetables in a meal as opposed to going to food that's not going to provide the same nutritional value. Those kind of very, very simple improvements. And then, of course, you've got what I call the 22 hours. So outside of your 2 hours of training, what about the 22 hours in terms of recovery, in terms of mindset, in terms of just confusion and distraction that is in the player's life that's going to add stress and anxiety to them? So those are 2 key areas that you can have a huge impact on straight away. And people would probably be surprised at the improvements that can be made in professional athletes. One of the most important things is making things as simple as possible, as streamlined as possible throughout. For example, particularly with travel, so you just reduce the amount of anxiety, concern an athlete might have. Well, that's just another thing freed up in the mind. They can concentrate on the game, concentrate on what they need to.
You've worked with so many different pro teams. Do they overcomplicate it? When I watch sports, you got a guy that's running, say, a linebacker running a 4.5, but then he's always a second too slow, where it's like, well, he's probably put in a position where he's having to focus on too many, he's reading the quarterback, reading the running back, reading the tight end or whatever. Instead, like you mentioned in your book, you should basically tell players, like, these are three things. And the overarching one is just, let's just win the fucking game. And then you have a couple other components. I see this all the time where it's like, that guy's a stud athlete, but why is he getting outrun by some slow ass tight end or something?
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you're driving somewhere and you got a buddy in the car just telling you, hey, listen, watch out for this car, you got to make a turn here. And it gets annoying and frustrating. Sometimes the great coaches simplify things, and they are very, very aware of the need to allow this expert, like the athlete is an expert. They've got so many reps, so many games, so much experience. I describe it as lifting the handbrakes off the player to allow them to go and do it. Now, obviously, you give them some clear, 3 points or 3 directions, 3 key things that are new to this particular instance. But very often, like I said, the best coaches remove the anxiety, remove the confusion, keep things simple. Particularly in soccer, some coaches are brilliant at using the media to do this. So they'll create issues or, non-essential issues that the media get distracted by, focus on to take pressure off players, things like that. But one other thing that has become probably something I've become quite aware of as well is that the larger the backroom staff, the more coaches that are involved, everybody feels a desire to have an input into the player, wants to speak to the team, wants to speak to the players. The more voices you have, the more that can complicate things. So just being aware often that 80% of your job is knowing what not to do, is knowing what not to say and when not to say it. Sometimes, recognizing, okay, this is the person that this is the priority at this moment in time.
I also read your other book, The 59 Lessons Working with World's Greatest Coaches, Athletes, and Special Forces. And that was a big theme throughout that book, was not having too big of a staff, as well as in your book, Game Changers. I think one of the other themes in Game Changer, at least, was that there's maybe a reliance on too much data and analytics and stats. And it seems like maybe there is, just because they're easy to measure. People want to be able to measure something, but just because you're measuring something doesn't mean that what you're measuring actually has any bearing on the results of winning or not winning.
Yeah, when you're working in a sporting environment and you have access to a lot of data, probably the most important quality is a ruthlessness in recognizing that often you struggle to find a correlation between this particular number, statistic, area, and an outcome. And over time, sometimes you make these loose, you make a strong association. In reality, there's a very poor relationship. So you start focusing on the number to try and make it match, or vice versa. The beauty of, I've said this many times, sports science, I should say it about analytics, they don't answer a question. What they do is they allow you to ask a better one. So you get 2 numbers that may match, you may find a correlation or not, but that's just the starting point then to inform, again, the other expert, which is the coach, or maybe it's the coach and the player. Hey, I found these 2 outliers, or found this particular number. When this is high, this other actual outcome seems to be far less frequent, or vice versa. And so it informs your decision making. So when you look at everything in its totality, the coach, their experience, their intuition, their instinct, and the data and the player, and when you combine that with the analytics, that's a decision support system. So it's all of these things. And to your point as well, there are many things that we're not collecting that are probably very, very important. We're just not even aware of yet.
In your book, you talked a little bit about Moneyball and Billy Beane, who is the general manager of the Oakland A's, which started this trend towards, or what do they call it, sabermetrics, or advanced analytics. I guess I should say advanced analytics in air quotes. But you mentioned that baseball is just a much different game. Baseball is essentially a one-on-one activity. You have a few elements of team, but really you have a pitcher versus a batter. And in football, if the guys aren't blocking, the quarterback's on his ass. And in baseball, you just got a pitcher and a hitter for the most part. And like you mentioned, basically, what did Billy Beane focus on? Wasn't it just on base percentage? Like who gets on base? You get on base, and he focused really on just one key metric. But other sports, I don't necessarily think you're able to, or I should say other team sports, you're not really able to focus on one metric like you are in baseball, are you?
Yeah, I used to joke that in baseball it was a little bit simpler. If you really wanted to compare both, we'll have the pitcher and hitter moving, and then have 11 guys also moving around, and then put an umpire in the middle trying to screw it all up. If you really wanted to compare complexity. But in truth, I remember when Bill James did the original research, and I remember going back through, and here I am, I know nothing about baseball, I don't know where the ball's pumped or stuff, and going back through all of the initial metrics that he started to use and the rationale for them. And that's more important is, okay, why was this important? And understanding those. The biggest challenge, though, in team sport is the volume of data. You don't actually have a lot of data per individual. That's the first thing. And the second thing is it's quite difficult to collect that data because every time you're looking at, for example, a pass or a shot, the context has changed. So, for example, even if you just look at shots taken, well, was he surrounded by 2 players, 3 players? What location was he? So to actually produce quality data to be able to analyze, it's a lot more difficult in team sport. Even looking at, I remember initially I looked at injury data because what my initial reason for looking at sabermetrics, I remember going to meet some of the statisticians that Billy Beane used, and also used statisticians that worked in casinos, because those are some of the better people in terms of risk, and it actually matters there. But when I went and we looked at the data and we analyzed it, it was very, very difficult for us to find patterns. And the answer kept coming back to me, Fergus, you've collected a lot of data, but it's not even enough to be anywhere valid for looking at injury. And the other big lesson from it was you can't predict injury. You can look at probability, but not predict. And so those are some of the big learning outcomes from the data. That's not to say that analytics and data are not useful. They're incredibly useful, but it's understanding their value when it comes down to then that art of knowing how much emphasis to place on them. One last point as well, when we're dealing with the human's a complex adaptive organism. Complex, there's so many different factors involved, space, time, location on the field, all of that. They're adaptive. So because something happened yesterday, doesn't mean they're going to happen today. The human learns from it, or it could be maladaptation as well. It could get worse from it, not just better. And it's an organism. It has feelings, emotions. So stress, anxiety, all of those things. That's a lot different from taking predictive analytics from, say, a manufacturing plant, measuring a CNC lathe or, a laser that is far more predictable. So just knowing that you just simply can't take something from technology, transfer it to this complex adaptive organism and expect predictive outcomes is worth bearing in mind.
One of the other themes I gathered from reading a couple of your books was that it seems like maybe athletes focus too much on their physical abilities and not enough on the technical, psychological components of their game. And then I was thinking recently, it's like I see a lot of, I watch mostly NFL, but I see a lot of hamstring injuries. And then I started doing some research in Europe, where you're from, and soccer or football, whatever you call it over there. It seemed like in the last 20 years, the hamstring injury rate has doubled. And then in the NFL, it quite hasn't doubled like it has in soccer, but American football, the hamstring injury rate has also gone up. If we have all these advanced metrics and sport science, why are we seeing more, injuries? And in the NFL too, I think the stats are kind of a little deceiving. They've changed off the kickoff rules. Like, how often do you see a return in the NFL today? It's pretty much never. You just kneel the ball and get it at the 25-yard line. Even with that, you would think there should be less injuries because there's less opportunities, but that hasn't been the case. So why are we seeing more injuries in these leagues?
I think there are a few reasons. That the simplest answer is things are always changing, and being aware of that's so important. Like surface is changing is a massive one, of course. One of the other issues that coaches and players have to deal with is every time you change from artificial to grass or vice versa, there's an adaptation period. It takes a while. Again, these are highly tuned athletes, so it does take a while for them to adjust to the surface. You run faster on an artificial surface, which again should be better for the game, but now reaction times have to be quicker. Not even just the throwing of the ball has to be quicker. So all of these things are a little bit different. Footwear changes also can be another factor. There don't seem to have been as many because of that. The biggest change in the NFL was really around COVID, with shortening of, off-season, preseason times and that adjustment. So again, the longer that players are off or stationary, and God knows they need it because it's been a punishing season, but that does reduce then the run-in time. So now you've got a sudden increase in workload. You've got a higher injury risk. One other factor then as well is the adjustments that we make. It's kind of like the Heisenberg effect. The moment you try and reduce an injury by doing more training, well, now you're stressing that muscle more. But if you haven't reduced the actual playing load or training load, the overall load is higher. So depending on the team in particular, there could be many, many reasons for it. But just every single time you make a change to a rule and a surface, and perhaps then the training time or exposure that a player has, those are three things that have gone into the change, and you're not even sure which one it is. So the answer is it could be any one of those.
Do you think that a lot of pro athletes are overtraining in today's day and age? I was listening to a podcast with Mike Wall, who's a former offensive lineman for the Green Bay Packers, and he basically attributed Clay Matthews toward the end of his career always having hamstring injuries with like kickboxing with I can't think of the name, Jay Glazer, kickboxing with Jay Glazer. And then, I think Tiger Woods is doing all these workouts with Navy SEALs, and it seemed like he all of a sudden had knee and back injuries. And I have a master's in health and human performance. And for my undergraduate, I interned with Bell and Sports Medicine, which has a partnership with the Green Bay Packers. I'm from Wisconsin. But anyways, so I was around pro athletes and pro coaches. And at the time I was actually bodybuilding, but I worked out way more than these guys. And I should say with weight training, they did a lot of prehab and mobility and things like that, which I wasn't doing. But I was like absolutely shocked at how little they worked out with weights. And then you see some of these pro athletes in the off season on TikTok and just doing these insane workouts. And it's like, man, then you wonder why they tore, or I shouldn't say, you don't wonder at all why they pulled a hamstring in the regular season.
Yeah, I think the rule I always have is that if it's something that a player did as a youth and they were coming through and they enjoy doing it, let them keep doing it, because, excuse me, their nervous system doesn't have to adjust to that. And in some ways, it's actually an escape for them. So I've often had players, for example, swimming was something that they loved doing. Some of them would do it, maybe not the night before a game, but they would do it the week of a game, and they enjoyed it. So it wasn't a change to them. But there can be a risk with older athletes trying something new. And initially, they get a huge enjoyment from it because it's incredibly stressful. They feel like they've done a lot of work. But you are changing a lot of patterns. Like you can see an Olympic sprinter taking up a new hobby towards the end of their career, a new physical hobby necessarily. So I think that in some cases, they can be overtraining, and it's more to do with the nature of the overtraining as well. If it's incredibly physical, how much time is that leading, or how much time is that taking away from their recovery in between what's going to be very, very hard training? I think in the off season, I think it's good for players to get a bit of a break. I remember some of our NFL players used to love playing pickup basketball, and they enjoyed it. It was something they'd done since kids, rarely got injured, and that was good for them. And it was good for them to get a mental break from the game. But in season, now you're running a risk. I remember an Olympic coach telling me the very first thing he did when he got to the Olympic village was he would look out for every frisbee he could find. That was the first thing he took away, because the last thing you wanted when you get to the Olympic village is, a high jumper or a sprinter jumping for a frisbee, landing on a curb and twisting an ankle on the route. So a lot of it does come down to, I hate to use the term common sense, but yes, players who take up very strenuous new hobbies do put themselves at a slightly different risk.
One of the concepts in your book that you mentioned that I'd never heard of was the 10th man concept. Basically, the 10th man is that if 9 people agree on something, the 10th person should look for flaws in the argument and take the contrarian view. And as you were mentioning before, how you never really saw baseball, and all of a sudden now you're working with these baseball players, that gave you this outside perspective. But first off, did that help not ever actually being involved in some of these sports to be able to be that 10th man? And what are some examples that you've seen that were able to help people?
I think there are a few things, Jesse. Like, I mean, sometimes when you're in cultures that are in very hierarchy and nobody wants to point out the obvious mistake, and then at the end, when it fails, everybody goes, yeah, well, I was kind of thinking that. Well, why didn't you say something? You know, it's really, really helpful to have people tear things apart. You know, the 2 phrases that I would always use when managing a team or putting a team together was, you can't offend me, and now break this for me, tear it apart. Like if there was a new system we're putting in place or a new thing we're putting in place, like actively tear this apart. And often people need to be encouraged to do that. And sometimes you do get a herd mentality where people just nod and go along and nobody's really thinking. I think it was Colin Powell said, if everybody's agreeing with me, nobody's thinking, you know, properly about the problem we have or properly at my proposal. It's better that somebody in the room pulls it apart than your enemy or your opponent pulls it apart. It's one of the huge benefits of having a diverse background, or people with diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences. They're going to see things differently. You don't want people just arguing for the sake of it, but you do want people to look at things with different lenses and being able to look at it and go, well, why aren't we doing that? Is there's a more obvious way? Particularly if you just take, for example, injuries. A lot of jumpers get Achilles injuries. Well, it might be helpful to maybe not have them on staff, but if you've got a lot of Achilles injuries, we'll find out what sport suffers the most Achilles injuries and go and figure out how they deal with them. That's always been a tenet for me. If it was vision, I remember vision was a big trend for a period. So you go and find the 3 best world experts on vision. I remember going to Manchester United. There was a lovely lady, Gail Stevenson, who was an expert in colour and colour recognition. She had changed the Manchester United jersey. Actually, what had happened was they'd gone behind in a game. They were wearing a new shirt, a new jersey that year. They had gone behind in the game. I think it was against Southampton. And the coach changed, Alex Ferguson changed the jerseys as halftime, which probably landed him a huge fine, shouldn't have done. And she contacted him and told him, you were right to do it. And the reason is that, you know, such a mild colour was blending into the background, so players on the outside wouldn't be seen. So that, I remember spending time with her, understanding, for example, the design of jerseys. Why do some jerseys stand out? And you can't obviously change every jersey, but in the future, you can ensure that, for example, the design is more supportive of players on the periphery. Like one of the simplest things about vision is that it's not necessarily color that people react to first, but it's movement. So is there a way that, for example, jerseys that have, particularly in closed sports, that movement, so that might be patterns on shoulders, can be seen? There was another myth where in rugby, for example, some teams would shift the central logo, the sponsorship, slightly off center, because the coaching would always be hit the logo in the middle. Well, if it's off center now, the players are tackling off center, which of course is a disadvantage. But again, those are examples of where, when you're dealing with margins, you find the best person in the world in that space and understand it's not the technique, it's the principle that they're using. And can you bring the principle back, and can you apply it in your sport and make an improvement?
When you're in these professional sport organizations, how advanced are these? You see things on, and you mentioned this in your book, but when you hear things on the news, or I shouldn't say news, but like sports talk radio or ESPN, Fox Sports 1 or something, they're just throwing around platitudes because they have 2 or 3 hours show to fill. A lot of times you can even tell these people never even watch the game that they're talking about. It's like the 40-yard dash in football. I mean, the 40-yard dash is one of the worst metrics to use, because it's like, well, how often is a player actually running 40 yards in a straight line with no pads on? And oftentimes football, the NFL, it's played in like a box, right? It's played in 5 or 10 yard increments anyways. But when you're working with, say, the San Francisco 49ers, how in depth are these conversations? Are they turning every stone that's unturned, so to speak, or whatever the expression is?
In a lot of organizations, there's a lot of pressure to get things taught, get things learned. I think there's a time constraint as well. Obviously, the number of minutes you can actually have a player in the building, is counted. And then the more and more people, the more and more voices that have to be done. I think there's certainly a way to be more efficient, free up time, and then turn over some more basic, simple stones, back to your Pareto principle. And one of the phrases I learned very early on from a coach was, small is big. Having a small core team who interact with the players can be very, very efficient. It means communication among that background team is excellent. And then you can have an outer layer of consultants, experts that actually educate those that are going to speak to a player, as opposed to just having a huge backroom team. So that's one of the things that it's a challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations, because the more people you have in a support staff, the more people are going to want to talk to players, feel that they need to prove their value, but also the more communication then that is needed among the backroom staff. And you need alignment, because imagine, for example, you come in after a game, you feel you did poorly. Actually, you had a really good game, but you feel you did poorly. One person comes over, claps you on the back, says, "Great game, you did excellent." But a trainer comes over and says, "Hey, next week will be better." These are all confusing messages. And depending on your relationship, they're going to have a different impact. And then finally, the psychologist might see you 2 days later, and then they give you a version. But you've got all of these other voices that actually impact, for example, your mood, your confidence, your resilience, all of those different things. So the size of the backroom team is probably a bigger impact than a lot of people are aware.
In the book, you mentioned about just having the same terminology, and I'll reference another Mike Wall podcast, but he was talking about how important to have the same language or terminology. And I think the example you give in the book is basically like speed. To some person, speed is speed, say 40-yard dash. To someone else, it's quickness. To someone else, maybe it's explosiveness. Maybe to someone else, it's agility. But if you're trying to convey that message and everyone has a different, the strength coach, offensive line coach, running back coach, head coach all has a different terminology of what speed is, which should be a fairly simple concept, then no one really knows what they're talking about. No one really knows how to, basically enhance it. A very simple concept can be quite, actually, I don't know what the word I'm just looking for now, but you get what I'm asking.
No, it can be confusing. What you've just said, a lot of people wouldn't, even be aware of. I remember one very, very classic example where, if you take a 40-yard dash, you've got different phases. Like you said, the last 10 meters, that's speed to some people, whereas the first 3 or 4 steps are quickness. You know what I mean? But I remember one coach, and the way I figured out how to get, actually, the very first time I realized language was so important was when I had the room in stitches, when I used the word vitamins and teams vitamins. Okay, I got it. Okay. So that's an obvious one. But later on then, when you're talking to the actual coach and you say to him, you sit down with him and you go through 1 or 2 players, you say, look, what is the one physical quality here we can improve in this player? And he says, well, I want more pop. Well, WTF pop? Like, what is that? And he would say, that when he goes, I'm talking about a linebacker. And he said, look, and we're in his office, sat down, and he showed me what he was talking about in my language was the first step. Now, if you bring that back, for example, to the strength coach, that's max effort. That's what that translates to in the gym. So pop was first step, was explosive power. And obviously this is where weight comes in, very, very important at that moment as well. So then that became the term to describe that physical quality expressed on the field. First step was pop. Because you always use their language. You use the language that the coach is going to use with the player. So when the player comes into the gym, you say, okay, this is what we're going to work on to improve your pop. Coach knows the same language. So you adapt your language to suit the environment you're in. You don't go to Italy and speak French. But understanding that then gives greater alignment then across everybody. And like speed, again, you've got starting speed, you've got acceleration speed, you've got speed, strength, speed, and then you've got max speed. Not to complicate it, but there's 5 or 6 different types of speed that each would be improved in a different way. the question is, what does the coach want improved? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the strength coach, performance director, nutritionists think. And even just communicating between, for example, a strength coach and a nutritionist. I've seen examples where the nutritionist is trying to put on weight on the player because that's what they believe. It's not being communicated clearly what the priority is. They're trying to put on weight and the strength coach is trying to reduce it. And then the player's getting on the scales and they're not even sure what's supposed to be happening. And none of it really matters. It's what does the coach or the offensive or defensive coordinator want to help the player play the game. So again, having that cohesion and alignment is so important in a background staff and in a support staff.
Yeah. Well, then you get into like what these NCAA college athletes, they hire some expert to help them get the fastest 40 time, probably drop a little bit of weight to make themselves quicker. And then does that even translate on the field? If you're running the wrong route, it doesn't matter how fast you are.
Yeah. And to be fair, in that instance, what you have is, you've got a player who plays the game. And then for a period of time, then they got to prepare for essentially a different, if you will, game. So again, everything is reduced in terms of the complexity. You get a set number of tasks, bench press and 40 and all of those tasks. So it's a lot easier than just to focus on those. We can maximize performance for those specific tasks. In reality, I think it's a few years ago, I think it was Bill Belichick was the first coach. I think he might have gone, but they didn't bother sending coaches to the combine because really what matters is game film. Study that, watch that. Nothing else really matters. Working with GMs, there's a lot of really interesting questions as well about players who, for example, make sudden improvements in body weight or in sudden improvements in a 40-yard dash. Well, the question would be, why were those changes so dramatic in that window and perhaps not during the season? Is that a commitment issue? Does that show a lack of resilience or sustainability over the length of their career? So it's interesting how suddenly great results then perhaps can cause deeper questions to be asked about the player. So there are a lot of really, really interesting things. But at the end of the day, game film is all that matters. What you do on game day is the only thing really that matters.
In your book, The Game Changer, you write, quote, "In my experience in modern professional sport, the majority of issues that we see on the field have nothing to do with playing. They are usually caused by stressors off the field. They can be anything from relationships to substance abuse issues to financial or contract concerns. This is truer the higher up the professional ladder that you go," end of quote. And as you started the podcast talking about the human element, or I guess humans really don't change regardless of the profession. But how, if you were a coach or a manager at a corporation, whatever, how do you implement things that are off the field and try to correct those issues to get better results in the office or on the field?
Well, the very first thing is that, if you're looking at a veteran in the NFL or even somebody with 3 or 4 years in the NFL, it doesn't actually take NFL, take business. You hire that person because they're very, very good at that job. If suddenly the performance starts to deteriorate, well, the argument is that person didn't suddenly get bad overnight. You hired them, they have experience, they can do this job well. So if the job hasn't changed, what else has changed? Is it the culture? Is it the environment? Or are there things off the field, so to speak, that are affecting them? And so you will see often, just a lack of awareness of that, ending up with a lot of people not performing at the level they should. And a lot of it can come down to just simply lifestyle things. It can be relationships. It can be, for example, particularly in soccer, one of the things I found unusual at the beginning was that if players and their partners, if they just had their first child, coming up to the next game, we would make hotel rooms available for them where they could spend 2 or 3 nights in the hotel. That didn't mean they didn't go home. It was just they could go to the hotel and get a good night's sleep for the night or two coming up to a game. But that's just an awareness of the fact that things have changed outside for this player. How can we support them? And again, free up the handbrakes. Also simply supporting the player, because in many cases, players will get a new contract. Now they've got more resources coming to them. Are they able to, have they confidence in how that resource is going to be either saved or assigned to them? And then you also have, for example, players who are coming towards the end of a contract, and the uncertainty causes stress and anxiety. They're not sure what's going to happen. They haven't been communicated with. And that might have nothing to do with the head coach or the coach that's coaching them directly. That could be front office. The coach isn't aware of it. The player's a little bit more anxious coming in over a number of weeks. Then they become a little bit more stressed, maybe not sleeping as well, because this is a big issue for that player. They're more irritable. You add these things, they accumulate, and all of a sudden then you get a small bust up at training. But the source is something that could be very easily addressed with communication. But sometimes it's just pausing for a second and going, what was the source of this? Has there been a change in lifestyle? Is it a security issue in terms of contract or not? Small things like, when I say small things, they are small pebbles in the shoe, but over time, those stressors and anxiety can accumulate and can affect the on-field performance.
I got another quote from your book, since I like to do the quotes here. You say that sports as a product is entertainment first and foremost. I've often said that the most advanced sport in the world is WWE wrestling. It is pure entertainment. This is the direction that most professional sports are heading in. They are entertainment entities first, sport teams second, kind of end of your quote. And then later on, you basically mentioned how Roger Goodell is essentially Vince McMahon, or kind of, I guess, promoters, whatever. Do you think that there was a golden age of professional sports? Like, the only time I ever watched baseball was during the steroid era. It's the only time I ever found the game to be interesting, when they had Barry Bonds and Sosa, McGuire, jacking these moonshots, and what was it, at Giant Stadium where people were in their canoes or kayaks, whatever, grabbing the balls out of the bay, which I thought was entertaining. In football, probably Tom Brady was the start of it, where the league was so focused on protecting the quarterback that to me, like Brett Favre would probably still be playing right now if they had the same rules that they have now.
Yeah, this is a huge topic. I think comparing Roger Goodell to Vince McMahon might be pushing it a bit, considering the last few months, but that would be unfair. But the point I was making was that this is a product, and you'll hear the term "the product" being used. All sports will use that term. So it is a product that has been sold to people, and so there is a balance between, even just for example, the commercial time that's neat. The commercial, the halftime show in the NFL changes an NFL game completely in the Super Bowl. Okay, you get so much longer, and so those things affect the performance staff and the coaches, and being aware of that is that it's not solely about performance. And so the brand, the product, those things are really, really important for the actual franchises in and of themselves. You just have to look at the last Super Bowl. I think apparently there was a famous singer present at the game, and that, helped increase. But again, that's an example of how...
Taylor Swift, is that we were referring to Taylor Swift, right? Swifties, yeah. Whatever.
Yeah, and again, that's great for the product. There's nothing wrong in that. But it's an artist that the product itself is something separate then from the actual performance, or that as the game evolves as a product, as an entertainment product, then you as in support staff or backroom staff, that's going to impact how you actually prepare players, how much time you have, the limitations. For example, even just media demands now reduced. I remember as those changes were introduced to certain sports, trainers would get frustrated because players missed a therapy session because they had media to do. Where is he? He's at media. Or he didn't show up for rehab because he was at media. And so that now has become part and parcel of the preparation of a player. And it's just important to factor that in. And with changes in NIL, that now is filtered down to college sports as well, of course.
Yeah, I was wondering how the NIL and the transfer portal is going to change college football. You're already seeing some coaches. The head coach of Boston College is now the defense coordinator of the Packers. Chip Kelly left UCLA as a head coach to become an offensive coordinator at, I believe, Ohio State.
The biggest consequence of that, I think, is the loss of Nick Saban. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think that perhaps in time we might find out that the NIL was a major factor in that decision. The long-term consequences are, though, that there is a pool of money that was available to universities and to athletic departments, through boosters and donors. A lot of that money would have been used for facilities, for buildings, even for the wider university. That pool, that availability for facilities, for staff, for buildings and all of that now is being reduced because so much more of that's going to directly to the players. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's good that there's a realization that college sport is in effect professional sport, or college football at least. So that problem, if you will, that's been created, there's a solution for it. The long-term consequences, though, for the players hasn't been really thought out. That would be a concern, that you have essentially players or entities who are in and of themselves products and considering themselves as products and brands. It used to be years ago, the focus was on talent development. So how do we improve the talent? Then the change moved to talent ID because, well, if we can identify talent, we don't have to develop it. Right? So let's focus on that. Now it's shifted to brand ID because if we can recruit, attract a good brand, well, now we get more attention. And the next phase would be, how do we develop a brand? You're even seeing that some places now where, can we find talent or a brand, a good brand, and can we develop it? So I think those are the different changes that you're seeing in sport overall. But just referencing the WWE, the smartest thing that they did a long time ago was realize that, yes, performance is important, but the characters, how we sell, how we promote, again, the product is a really, really important factor.
Yeah, when Nick Saban retired, I actually thought the same thing you did. The first thing to come to my mind was like, yeah, it's probably the NIL. Maybe not so much the transfer portal for him. And then I was listening to an analyst recently. He's talking about the Milwaukee Bucks, how they traded for Dame. And all of a sudden, the Bucks defense has obviously gotten worse. But with that particular trade, he was saying the GM knew that the team would be worse, but they wanted to keep the Greek freak under contract and extend him. Going back to your quote, these are ultimately businesses, and it's like the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys are still the biggest brand in the NFL, and they haven't won anything since the 90 Cowboys, but they're always in the headlines. Jerry Jones is always saying stuff. You got Micah Parsons with his podcast. Would you rather make money if you're the owner, or would you rather win? That's the question for the owner, but I tend to think these people really don't care. It's a soap opera. I mean, NFL, at least in the United States, not necessarily, obviously not in Europe, but in the U.S., is the biggest soap opera for men on TV.
Yeah, those are all, every one of those questions. Like, talk about the Cowboys. It's the most valuable franchise, I think, in the world. Certainly in the NFL, year on year, consistently. And there's no correlation with results. In fact, actually, I think of the top five, I think the Niners and the Patriots are the only ones who have reached Super Bowls in the last number of years, if you look at the valuation. And again, that's primarily down to do with exposure. The exposure obviously is not coming from, Super Bowls or winning games. In most cases, it's to do with headlines. But that's the business of sport. Again, it's a business. And so that's a decision made at ownership. But again, it does also show how difficult it is to win. And again, one other important factor that probably is missed by a number of people is, the American sports largely, I guess you could exclude the NBA from this, but they're largely domestic sports with a domestic interest. So obviously the demand now is, can we increase exposure worldwide? So now finding, recruiting or scouting international players just automatically opens up huge, greater markets internationally. So you will continue to see, for example, international games, Mexico, Spain, foreign players being attracted in. But the big challenge is going to be, particularly, for example, in football, even in the NBA, is getting them up to the speed of a game that perhaps they're not as familiar with as kids who are playing it coming out of Pop Warner or Pee-wee football.
We talked about the Pareto principle or the 80-20 principle. I think the opposite of that is probably Sturgeon's law, which basically says that 90% of everything is crap. So what are some of the biggest things that are just a complete waste of time?
Oh, Lord. There are a lot of them. The most important thing, I throw it out there as a useless statistic, but 80% of your job is knowing what not to do. So really good coach has a large toolbox. So they've had a lot of experience and they know which tool to take out of the toolbox for which particular issue, rather than throwing the whole toolbox at someone and saying, oh, this is all you can do. And that is a very, very important role of a coach. It's not how much they know, it's do they know which thing to implement or to propose at a specific time. And the skill is knowing what not to. If somebody is, for example, poor sleep, I can list 12 things you can do right now, but by sitting and talking with the player or understanding them, you can figure out, this one thing is actually a small switch that can work. Knowing that player, knowing their personality, knowing what they will do, knowing what they won't do. And so I can make an argument for anything, cryotherapy, infrared saunas, and you just have to go on Instagram. There's 100 experts out there who can tell you, but that's not the advantage. The advantage is in knowing a player and knowing what will work, what isn't, and what will give you the best effect for this particular instance. I'll give an example of a player one time who was struggling to sleep, had been struggling for a number of years actually. And again, always go with the rule of three. Wanted to talk about supplements. I said, look, let me and I could have given him a list of supplements, but I said, I'll be back to you, but can we just do these 3 things just to kick off? What time do you go to bed? I said, myself and girlfriend probably go to bed around 10 o'clock. I said, okay, 9 o'clock, turn off electronics and phone and everything. And so I want you to take a cold shower and then just go for a 20, 30-minute walk and then go to bed. And then I'll be back and we can talk about some of these other things, but just do that in the meantime till we get a chance to talk. And he texted me 3 days later. He said, Fergus, I've had the best sleep ever. He said, I turn off the phone, turn off the TV, like you said, iPad, all of that. I get the dog, myself, my girlfriend, after a cold shower, just go for a walk, come back. So it's been incredible. And we never even got to supplements or anything else. But the truth is that turning off the electronics was the most important thing I wanted him to do. The walk was actually a distraction because, yes, the cold air will be helpful and it was good for him to get out of the house, get some fresh air before he went to bed. But the real reason for the walk was so that he wasn't going to sit at home, start feeling bored, and then turn on the TV again. Going for a nice relaxing walk took him away from those things. So it was really only 2 things that were working: cold shower, turning off the electronics. So again, that's an example of knowing the simplest changes you can make are initially before you need to complicate things and start looking at tryptophan or, worse still, maybe Ambien or something like that. It depends on where the athlete is as well. I mean, if an athlete has a serious chronic insomnia, okay, maybe we need to use a hammer to crack this nut just to slow it down in the short term temporarily and then find stability. But again, it's knowing where the athlete or the person is at. But again, yeah, you give you a list of 50 things that will improve your sleep. But what are you going to do? What is the player realistically going to do? How can we start to build trust? How can we make a small change? Then we can build on it if need be.
Before we wrap this up, Fergus, what are things that businesses can do to be more productive?
The best teams, the best organizations have been around have had, I call it like a circle of trust and then a compassionately brutal culture. In other words, they'll have a meeting, close the door. It'll only be those people that matter. Not everybody's included. Like you won't have, Bob from head office in Indonesia there, but it'll be that core group that close the door. And essentially, they're brutally compassionate in that they're going to call each other out on things that they're concerned about, they want clarification about, and get to the problem, identify the problem quickly, and then come up with a solution. When you find that, when you understand what that purpose is, and you've got that clarity, and that really, it might seem like brutal from an outsider, but when everybody is aligned and they know what the objective is, you solve a lot of problems fast. And what it does is it removes this distraction. Jenny said this to me yesterday and I was offended by it, or, I don't like Bob's politics. Who cares? You know what I mean? Nobody cares. This is the objective. This is the purpose. And we're all working towards that. And when you get that little bit of tension on everybody's string and they're working in the same way, those insignificant things don't matter because people realize that everybody is working towards that same objective. And what you end up with then is you end up with honesty, which is the basis for trust. So you take Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. The underlying layer is honesty because you see what everybody's working towards and you have that clarity and you can move from there. That's one of the, in all of the best teams that have been around, like it's a really special feeling because you know where everybody stands, you know they're working towards the same thing, and you know that you don't agree with the other person completely. And that's a beautiful place to be.
Today we have Fergus Connolly. He's the author of 59 Lessons, Working with the World's Greatest Coaches, Athletes, and Special Forces, and also the author of the book Game Changer, The Art of Sports Science. Where can people find these books, get a hold of you? I know that you also are basically is a contractor the right word? A consultant? I'm not sure what the right word is. And then secondly, after you answer that question, just leave us with a final thought, whether it's related to any of your books or just something that is on your mind right now.
Yeah, just fergusconnolly.com. Everything's there. There's videos, books, links to the books and everything. The final thought is something that we mentioned at the beginning. The principles transfer. Techniques are many, but the principles are few, and they transfer among all high performers.
Right. And I think let me see here, or jotted this down, I believe. Where is that? I got humility, hunger, trust, accountability, commitment, hard work, and consistency are like platitudes, yeah. But they definitely transfer over.
I could ask the question, what does it take to be the best? I always give the answer triple H: humility, hard work, and honesty. If you've got those three things, you're going to be very hard to beat. But you've got to start at those three: being brutally honest with yourself, be humble about how much you know and how much you have to know, and nothing gets done without hard work.
And speaking of the best, in 59 Lessons and Game Changer, you mentioned many times about it. You don't hire the best, you hire the right person. And I think that was important because especially on paper, a lot of people can have the same resume, but does that personality, does that style, etc., fit in with the organization more so than do they philosophically align with the head coach or the defense coordinator, whatever it is? I'm not sure what the offense coordinator in soccer is called, but
yeah, no, it's something written about it quite a few times. The best person is generally measured by a metric, but you're hiring a human. There's a lot more to the human than just those particular metrics that you're looking for. So you want to be able to look at the person quantitatively and qualitatively, look at the holistic. And very often that may not be the best person, but it's the right person. And one other factor that you need to take into account is look at what they're coming into. So the seed, for example, will grow in certain environments. If you've got a wonderful culture and you've got somebody who can come into that culture and that culture can help grow them and develop them, that's the kind of person you're looking for. If you've got a wonderful technical training staff, but this person's lacking in that, but they've got all of these other qualities, well, brilliant. They're not the best person, but you know that you can train them up. And so knowing your organization well is probably the very first step before you go looking, okay, who's the so-called best person? You want to find the right person for you.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.